Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Council Business Planning Committee of the Whole for Wednesday, for Monday, July the 23rd. And I would like to call this meeting to order. This evening, we have, from Council point of view, we have to my far left, Councillor Paul McPherson, next Councillor Diane Regima. Off to my far right is Councillor Tony Bernay, and then Councillor Dave Thompson, and then Mayor Sandra Easton. I'm Rob Foster, and I'm also a councillor and chair of this committee. We have quite a few staff members here this evening, so just to recognize them, first of all, to my left is Mike Rokopoulos. He's our Chief Administrative Officer. Out in the audience, somewhere here, we have Carrie Beattie, and who's our Communications Officer, and Paul Diani, who's our Economic Development Officer. Julie Kirkolos is to my right. She is our Town Clerk. We also have Trish Sarnicki, who's the Deputy Clerk. From Finance and Admin, we have Angela Safani and Terry Trowola. Angela is our Director of Finance and Administration. Fire Department, we have both Greg Hudson, our Chief, and Bill Blake, our Deputy Chief, here this evening. Public Works, we have Dave Graham, and in Community Services, we have Shannon McKay. Did I get everybody? Oh no, I missed Matt Guadalongo. He's our IT Services gentleman. As well, we have Fire Chief Kane from Grimsby. Welcome this evening. And also, I should mention, we have Courtney O'Coin. She's our elections coordinator and is a co-op student here in the town. Are there any declarations of interest before we begin? Seeing none. Everybody's had the opportunity to look at the agenda for this evening. Are there any changes that are recommended for the agenda? Seeing none, we shall proceed as published. Our first item of order this evening is from KPMG. We have Mr. Scott Plugers here this evening, who is going to go through the 2017 financial statements and audit finding report.
Better? Okay. And I do talk pretty soft, so if I'm not speaking up or anything, just let me know, and I'll try and speak up a little bit. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. Certainly what I'll do over the next little bit is take you through the audit findings report. If you have any questions, by all means, just feel free to stop or interject, or otherwise save them till the end, just however you prefer. So, and throughout as we go, I will refer to the page numbers in the top right-hand corner as you're looking at that on your screens, or if you have it printed in front of you here. So we'll start on page 3, which is the executive summary. So a quick snapshot of what's to come in the audit findings report. But one comment to make on this page here is just that we had no material changes from the audit plan as we discussed with management during the audit planning season. You'll see here the audit risks and results. So there's a few pages in terms of areas that we'll highlight to you just of significant importance from the audit work that we did complete, as well as adjustments and differences. So one important point to note is we did not identify any differences that remain uncorrected for the December 31st year end. Okay. So on page 4, you'll notice if you looked at the financial statements, they do say draft on them currently. So there's a few procedures that are always remaining at this time of the audit. As you can see here, receipt of legal confirmation letters, subsequent event discussions with management, completing our discussions, of course, today, so that will happen at the completion of this discussion, receiving the signed management representation letter, and also obtaining, ultimately, council's approval of the financial statements. So your financial statements will have that draft watermark removed, and our opinion will be signed dated Wednesday. So just to make a quick reference to the financial statements, you will notice that the financial statements are an unqualified audit opinion, so certainly the most important thing to take a look at when you take a look at your audit report, just highlighting that the financial statements are prepared in all material respects in accordance with the relevant financial reporting framework. Control and other observations there, so we did not identify any significant deficiencies in internal control, which is important to note, but certainly we'll touch on that in a couple minutes. And lastly, just on page 4 here, with respect to independence, we are required to confirm each year to you that we are independent with respect to the town of Lincoln and the services that we do provide. Okay. So page 5 is just a nice little graph here to add a little bit of dynamic in terms of not just having wording on every pages, just in terms of how we deliver audit quality and our approach with respect to the audit throughout the course from planning right through to completion. Okay. So page 6 talks through our audit risks and results. So this page is just important to highlight as these are 2 required risks to identify in each and every audit that are completed. One being the fraud risk from revenue recognition and one being fraud risk from management override of controls. So with respect to the fraud risk from revenue recognition, we are able to rebut that risk if we don't feel that that is a risk at the entity. And certainly when it comes to the town of Lincoln, we do not believe in our opinion that this is a risk. So as you can see here, we have rebutted that there. We still perform procedures to address it, but certainly nothing has come to our attention and no significant audit findings with respect to that. The fraud risk from management override of controls cannot be rebutted. So certainly we have procedures in place to identify there, but as you can see, we did not identify any issues or concerns with respect to management override of controls. Page 7 on the audit risks and results. So I won't spend too much time on this, really just highlighting 2 significant areas of the audit with respect to revenue and government transfers as the town receives each year, being a significant portion of funding, and then tangible capital assets being quite a significant number that sits on your balance sheet, and the expenditures that are incurred there each year. So you can see in that paragraph there, just to highlight there on the corrected audit adjustment, which I will touch on in a few pages where it elaborates in a bit more detail there. You can see the difference has been corrected in the consolidated financial statements, and we understand through our discussions and our closing meetings with management that there is a process in place certainly to identify that and correct that, which will be subject to audit procedures certainly for December 2018's year end. Okay. Page 8, just with respect to materiality, so something we have to communicate each and every year is materiality. As you can see there, we've based materiality consistent with prior years based on total revenues of $27.2 million. So it's always based on the prior year revenues, which is an appropriate benchmark in a municipality, just given some consistency year over year. And you can see there, materiality for the group as a whole is 816,000. But the number that's of importance to you are those 2 numbers below. So one being performance materiality, and really, even though materiality is set at a certain level, we set it performance materiality at a lower level just to ensure that any aggregation risk or any undetected misstatements don't cause the financial statements to be materially misstated. And that last bottom number there, just for your reference, that's the number that if we identify anything during the course of the audit that is a misstatement that is in excess of that number, that is something that we have to bring forward to management's attention there. And then you can see at the bottom there, just splitting out between the corporation of the town of Lincoln as well as Penn West as your investment in your hydro component there. So just ensuring that we have materiality calculated for both of those there. Okay, page 9 walks through the accounting estimates. So there is quite a few estimates for the town of Lincoln audit, and you can see there nothing different from prior years, but contaminated sites liability, the post-employment benefit liability, and then developer contributed assets. So not too much to touch on here. I will touch on the fact that under contaminated sites liability, certainly we have pretty in-depth discussions with management and the relevant team members throughout the town of Lincoln, so not just finance, to ensure we've got a good understanding of any changes that might impact the liability year over year. So we have concluded that management's approach to identifying and estimating the value of that liability is adequate. When it says there's no formal process in place, I will touch on that in a few minutes, but nothing to cause concern there. It's really just not a formally documented process. So the process does occur each year, but just looking to kind of enhance that process. So we will touch on that in a moment. On the post-employment benefit liability as well, one point to note there is that the town did receive a new actuarial valuation each year. So this is determined through actuarial valuation. So we have to work to ensure that we're comfortable with the use of the actuary through the course of the audit, just in relying on management's expert, because we do rely on them to provide that calculation to us. We believe that management expert and management's assumptions are both adequate and appropriate for developing that liability. And then on developer contributed assets, none recorded in the year there, so really not too much to touch on, but just something that we do look at each year. Okay. Page 10 walks through our approach with data and analytics in the audit, so touching on our journal entry testing, and this is really where we spend our time just ensuring we're addressing that risk of management override of controls throughout the course of the audit, but there's no significant findings, nothing that came to our attention throughout the course of the audit with respect to that. Okay, page 11, financial statement presentation and disclosure here. So just highlighting that your financial statements are prepared in all material respects in accordance with public sector accounting standards, which is appropriate. There is an appendix at the last appendix of this report, which I will highlight, which are new standards that are applicable for the town for the December 31, 2018 year end. So certainly something that you'll want to be aware of just in your discussions with management. Okay. So page 12, this is just a summary of corrected adjustments and uncorrected adjustments if there were uncorrected adjustments, but we only identified one corrected adjustment, as you see there, with respect to tangible capital assets, and that is on when roads are resurfaced and just accounting for that disposal of the road that was previously recorded in the financial statements there. So you can see the impact, and that was corrected in the financial statements, and again, no uncorrected differences. Okay. So page 13 on control deficiencies or control observations. Just important to note again that these are not significant deficiencies as defined under Canadian auditing standards, but just other observations through discussions with management and throughout the course of the audit that we saw that we felt was of enough importance to highlight to you today. I won't read through this in detail. There is a lot of wording on there. But you know, through our closing meetings and discussions with management, we certainly understand there's processes in place to address these, so no concern from our standpoint, and certainly we'll make sure to look at that for the next year-end audit. So as you can see there, though, really nothing that's too major. Okay, and then our appendices, most of the appendices are really required communications in terms of background on professional standards and so on, and our approach to audit quality. But as I did mention, so there's two appendices I'll highlight. Appendix 6. If you're really interested, the audit report is changing slightly for next year. Not a huge change, but just sliding, changing where the opinion paragraph will sit. So it'll just be a little bit of a different layout for next year. And then Appendix 7 is the important appendix for yourselves, I think, to take away from this in terms of just ensuring that that management is actively reviewing these new standards that are applicable for next year and making sure there's a process in place. From our standpoint and across the municipal sector and public sector as a whole, we're not anticipating too many adjustments or changes as a result of these standards, but certainly a little bit of work is needed just to ensure that that is in fact the case. So that is our audit findings report for the year ended December 31st, 2017. I don't know if there's any questions on it. Happy to take any.
Councillor Bernay.
Thank you, Chair Foster. Through you to the presenter. So just wondering, in your report here, I think about things like liabilities and how things are changing. And just over the last couple of years, we've experienced some erosion, on our properties around Lake Ontario and Charles Daly Park.
Sure.
To the tune of about $1 million. Sure. You hear people talking about global warming and all the changes that are taking place. You look at some of the winters that we go through and the money that we spend as a municipality on salt and sand. Sure. And then, years where there's drought and, people are either watering or not watering and how that might affect our water bills and our revenue. Yeah. So just, when you look at, I'm sure KPMG must be doing audit reports for many municipalities. So is there something, as you go through this audit report that you see that is a concern or something that other municipalities maybe are doing that we could be looking at in terms of those things?
Sure. So that's, it's an appropriate question, and all of those things that you made reference to are certainly from the financial side, things that came up, whether it be, the flooding last year at Charles Daly Park, additional costs associated with that. So from a financial standpoint, again, we're focused on the audit of the financial statements, but from a planning standpoint, there's really nothing that, municipalities all have to deal with that in a certain way, right? So I guess what I'm struggling with is to answer that question mainly because we're focused on the financial statements as opposed to the operational aspect and budgeting and planning and so on. And how do you account from that year to year in terms of 1 year you have a drought, such as this summer, which has been quite hot, and water bills could be up. But, we noticed that water revenue and consumption from 2016 to 2017 actually decreased a little bit. So, I mean, all weather dependent there. So there's a lot of factors that go into play. But certainly if we saw something that was pervasive in terms of a process standpoint, we would recommend that. But it's not something that we truly delve into in the audit. And I don't think that truly answers the question, but.
Okay, fair enough, and maybe it was an inappropriate question, but I thought it was pertinent. One more question through you, Mr. Chair. So maybe something that is more pertinent in terms of, and our Director of Finance and Administration has been great this year. We've had some other presentations with regards to some of our long-term investments. Yeah. So when you look at our long-term investments as a municipality, it's a fairly significant number.
It is, yeah.
Fairly significant number. It's gone up over $1 million since 2016 to 17. So are we, in your estimation, are we too conservative? Are we right on the ball? Just in your opinion after going through this audit?
So likely risk averse, it would seem. Yeah, so quite conservative, I would think, in the sense that when you've got such a significant investment balance, and that's something that we had a discussion with, with management as well, because those are the, the financial things that come from the statements that we look at and say, okay, well, you've got such a significant balance, you're earning only X percent on that balance consistently. If you have no real immediate need for that funding in the next, 5 years, 10 years, and so on, whatever the future looks like, you have an opportunity there to be a bit more aggressive in that sense in terms of looking at what your returns are. I mean, ultimately that comes back to a decision at council and whether or not there's amendments to the investment policy and so on, but it's absolutely something that can take a look at. I mean, I can say for certain that, in looking at other municipalities that I do, the returns here for such a significant investment balance are, on the low to conservative end. And that's not to say that it's wrong, and it's certainly prudent, right, from a municipal standpoint. But I think, there's always considerations that need to be given. If like I said, in the next 5 years, you don't really need access to certain funds. You have opportunities to look at different investment strategies. And I think it's a worthwhile decision or discussion to be had, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mayor Easton.
Thank you very much for the report. I have a question in regard to your site contamination identification, and it has to do not only, I think that the recommendation you've made is one that the staff will take under consideration, but I'm noticing that there isn't any reference here to the conditions right now across the province in terms of site alteration, where soil is moved from one community to another, essentially with abandon. Is this part of the consideration for the audit? Are you thinking of that at all in this statement, or are you just looking at land that we've acquired?
Well, it's not just land that you've acquired in the year. It could be land that the town has had for several years. So I'm not, like, from a province-wide standpoint, if we're looking at other municipalities, certainly if there's other municipalities with similar, I guess, I don't want to call it similar contamination, because I don't think you could say that the contamination is the same from one place to the next. But, if there's something that we see that we identify in another municipal audit that has, ramifications or could have implications to the town of Lincoln, that's something we bring up, but it's not something that we look at directly.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, then I don't understand this, because under the potential effect, you're saying that there is a potential for the town to acquire properties in the year that are contaminated. In the first sentence, you're looking at a description here and saying that we don't have a formal process. Just give me an idea of what would the framework of that formal process look like?
I think so. Where that's coming from is, and what we understand through management, is that there is an informal process where discussions take place, whether it be in preparation for the budget, but maybe not in preparation at year end. So what happens if there's land that's acquired and there's no direct communication that makes its way to finance that says we've acquired this land, it's hard for us to go in and say, well, you have a complete listing of land to look at and say, are any of these properties potentially contaminated? When it comes to our audit of contaminated sites, we're more concerned with, is there new land acquired in the year, or something that has happened to existing land in the year that could potentially cause contamination. So that formal process is more just from a documentation standpoint to say, okay, we're, management, environmental and planning and so on is going to meet X number of times a year to update on any new properties acquired. Any knowledge that's had across the town ultimately makes its way back to finance. Where this is coming from is the fact that that didn't necessarily happen in such a seamless manner this year in terms of information making its way back to finance to update the liability, which is at the end of the day what we're concerned with is completeness of liability. So
Okay. All right. So when that group meets, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Before you continue, I'm going to go over to the CAO for a moment on this.
Great, thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair, I think just to dovetail on the comments that were made, sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, to the Mayor, I think just to dovetail on those comments, and without, I think, having to go into closed session to speak specifically about some of the contaminated sites that the town is in either receipt of this particular year or owns on a long-term basis. What we do on a semi-annual basis, as highlighted in the auditor's report, is often look at the monitoring that needs to happen on those sites. And so the budget is contingent to that particular monitoring. And so we do have a process. It's rather an informal process, I think, as has been highlighted, although we go through a very diligent conversation and a detailed conversation around the senior management team table, but the recommendation does highlight the need for us to have a more documented process, I think, than going through the questioning that we're going through around the table instead. And I think to the question around the soils and the soils moving, that is not what this particular element of the audit references.
Mr. Chairman, that's very helpful. And the way this was worded, I was actually, I was seeking really a framework, whether there was actually a list of questions that the auditors were expecting that we would be asking and answering. And so I'm going to, through you, Mr. Chairman, is that the case? Are you recommending, you're recommending that it be more formalized, but are you recommending the process?
Well, we can suggest processes. I mean, certainly we can't dictate a process because it's ultimately management's implementation that has to happen. But there's no formalized questionnaire to your comment there. It's the questions are more: is there any new properties? Is there any contamination that has moved to other areas or sites maybe possibly not owned by the town, but the town still has to assume responsibility for? That's a key area. Or any increase in monitoring costs, any unknown costs, any planned one-time costs, because where that all comes back to is, does it factor into the liability? So really it's just a kind of a comprehensive discussion to say, what has changed with respect to our properties that we need to be aware of from a contamination standpoint, whether it be new properties, expansion, of contamination, updated monitoring as well. So perhaps the fact that if there's a new monitoring report that says now that contamination has now come down below an environmental standard to where it's an acceptable level, those are all things that have to come into play.
Okay, well, Mr. Chairman.
And just as well with that, the clerk has pointed out to me that if we want to get into any specifics or anything, we should go into closed session because it is an issue around property within the municipality.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that. And I can say to you that this council has been kept apprised of all of the status of all the situation. I think it's a wise recommendation that you're making here, but I think we're pretty familiar. We are very familiar, actually, with what we're dealing with, and I don't need any specific information. So I just wanted clarity on how much emphasis you were putting on this. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Do we have a motion for this at this point? I have a motion in front of me here from Councillor Brunet and seconded by Councillor Thompson that the presentation by the delegation be received. Are there any questions to this motion? All those in favor? That is carried. I was remiss earlier, by the way. I'm not saying who wasn't here this evening. Councillor McMillan is ill, and And Councillor Timmers had a recent operation, and she's recovering at home. So we're looking forward to seeing her back here as soon as we can. My discussion with her today, the classic Facebook discussion, is she said she's getting up and she's getting around, so that's a very good thing. The other is Councillor Patrick, and apparently it's his birthday today, so he's out celebrating somewhere. So we'll just leave it at that. Let us move to the next item, and that is, by the way, there's no correspondence, and so we'll go into reports, and the first report is report to adopt Niagara West Emergency Management Program. It's on page 62. Mr. Hudson, would you like to speak to this report, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, emergency management is an essential service that every municipality is not only compelled to deliver in terms of legislation, but it's also a responsibility to the citizens to make sure that we're able to prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies. Typically, the typical model is that the fire chief by default gets the job of being the community emergency management coordinator. And with all the fire chief jobs and duties, quite often, I think Chief Kane can attest to this, that quite often we, devote time to this activity on a corner of a desk type of a situation where we don't really necessarily give the amount of time and resources to it that possibly we could or we should. In keeping with kind of a principle of looking at ways we can improve efficiencies and to work well with other partners and community agencies, the town of Lincoln, as well as the township of West Lincoln and the town of Grimsby, sought to create a shared service agreement to deliver this important service. And what we have before us now is basically a report recommending the adoption of a joint emergency management program for West Niagara, which also includes the township of Wainfleet. And secondarily to that, subject to budget approval, to share a emergency manager to actually manage our respective emergency management programs and to enable us to be prepared for an emergency should one happen. That seems to be happening more and more as our climate changes, as Councillor Brunet pointed out in previous discussion. And as well, just to assist us with achieving compliance and making sure that we're ready for any emergency that we may experience. The other thing, if we embark upon this venture, is there are some efficiencies and some synergies that we can capitalize on. One major one is we would no longer have to maintain a secondary emergency operations center. We'd be able to utilize the other municipalities within the agreement, and there are some other operational efficiencies as well. So, thank you. If there are any questions.
Thank you, Chief. And also, and maybe this is not normal, but Chief Kane, thank you for coming this evening. Do you have any comments on this from a Grimsby point of view, or? Please step forward. Thank you very much. Are there any questions to either or of the chiefs? So let's start with Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is really good to see the collaboration between the four communities. I think it's something that we are looking for in this end of Niagara, that these closely knit communities are working together to come up with things like this. So I like the concept. My only question is, who owns the emergency? So when it comes right down to the day of the emergency, is it the fire chief that owns the emergency?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councilor's question. The emergency really resides in the location where it exists. Now, having said that, quite often when we experience a large emergency, it goes beyond jurisdictional boundaries, and we ended up reaching out to our neighbors in any event, and ultimately to the region and higher up the food chain. So to attempt to answer your question, the emergency really, who owns it really depends on what the nature of the emergency is and where it is occurring. For instance, if it's a weather emergency where we have flooding and things of that nature, it would actually be more of a public works responsibility, and the other departments and or the other communities would play a support role in that. If it were something like a hazardous material spill or major fires, things like that, then that would be more likely a fire emergency. And similarly, the other departments, the other communities would also play a support role.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So for clarification, the emergency manager does not play that role. The emergency manager is creating the document or creating the plan along with the committee, as I see in the report, along with the committee that's together. They are creating the plan, and then when the emergency happens, it's that particular area of expertise that takes control. Okay, so that being the case, that's great. So I guess the next question I would have is the role of that emergency management coordinator day in and day out, and what are they doing beyond the putting the plan together?
Through you, Mr. Chair, being it would be a shared position amongst 4 municipalities, they would be sharing their time, proportionately to the population. In addition to actually preparing for emergencies, there are a number of legislative duties that are required, such as community risk assessments, there's hazard identification, there's community critical infrastructure identification, there are training requirements each year for everybody who's involved in emergency management across all of our organizations. We have to plan and execute an annual exercise. This year, coincidentally, we will be doing a major field exercise, so there's quite a bit of organization and preparation for that. There's reaching out to other municipalities such as Red Cross, other agencies that may be affected to ensure that we have proper liaisons. There is actually the documentation and the compliance piece that we have to ensure that things are submitted to the province on a timely basis. So, and then we get into the business continuity of the organizations as well. There's a lot of work to do with that to make sure the plans are updated. And so it's actually, there's a lot to it. And as I say, maybe there's not enough for one person from one municipality, but when you put 4 communities together, there's going to be more than enough work to go around for one position.
I have Councillor Majima, then Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair Foster. So over the years, I've taken part in a number of seminars related to fire and emergency response. So I've learned quite a bit about the fire department's role in an emergency, and I'm well aware that should an emergency happen, that you're required to wear a dual hat. You're required to be on the ground doing a lot, and on top of what your current role is as fire chief. So I'm really happy to see that some of this is going to be lifted from you, because I often thought about that and how it would play out if something really disastrous happened. Thank goodness nothing's happened yet. So I'm really happy about that. And there's no doubt in my mind that this role of this new person, the person's going to be busy and they're going to have a lot to do and good things to do. And so the other question, I did have a question, and I think you answered it earlier on, that the implementation of this plan hasn't gone through a dry run or an exercise. You're going to be doing that this year, coming up soon, is that right?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. The actual plan itself consists of a core plan, which is very, very similar to what we have now in terms of, the roles and responsibilities of the various players, various procedures and whatnot. So the core plan is really very similar to what we have enacted now. The primary difference is we're actually collaborating and adding annexes that are community specific to the plan, and there's some additional pieces in there where there's cooperative ventures and things like that. So in terms of the exercise coming up in September, yes, it will be really our first kick at the cat, so to speak, to actually exercise the new plan, if adopted, yes.
That's great. So I also have a question. I was at a seminar or a presentation about a year ago, I guess already, about transportation of liquid nuclear waste. So is that something that's going to be discussed? Is it going to be a focus? Has there been any discussion about that so far?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, I have been in discussions at both levels, the federal and provincial levels of government. There are very robust plans in place, just due to the nature of the risks involved. They like to keep the information fairly secure, but there are means of getting information should an occurrence happen very readily. And so I feel fairly confident that we could handle an emergency. And quite frankly, the municipality's role in such an emergency would be very, very limited. Just due to the nature of the cargo. They have specialists from the federal government that would actually respond and mitigate the emergency. So our role would just essentially identify an area to, cordon off and keep people safe rather than actually taking part in it.
Yeah, so to paraphrase, you feel comfortable with what you've seen in terms of the federal government's preparedness for a liquid nuclear waste spill. That's good to hear.
At this point, and I might add that in speaking with some of the agencies involved, excuse me, that the containers that this material is shipped in are very, very safe. There's a number of fail-safe measures put into place. The Titanic said it was never sink, so there's always that risk of failure, but I think it's a reasonable risk, and I think it's something that's definitely manageable.
Okay, thanks very much.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Through you to the chief. Certainly, I'm all about finding efficiencies in group efforts between municipalities. Can you lay out what the cost of having our own is versus what the cost is going to be for the town, which I think is $50,000 based on what I'm seeing in the report for the joint position?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, the cost with salary and expenses and whatnot, we're sharing at this point, subject to signed agreement, is we're looking at a 35% share for both Grimsby and Lincoln, 20% share for West Lincoln, and a 10% share for Waynfleet in terms of cost sharing. So our component of that would be around the $50,000 mark.
Okay, thank you for that. So there is one position from what I'm gathering. Certainly, how are you going to manage the policy differences that you may run into with regards to councils? Or is it all going to be strictly based around the emergency services staff?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, the joint emergency management program will actually be the policy, and presumably if all four councils are actually adopting this plan, then that will be the common set of procedures and policies by which this position will operate. Okay. But there will be, within the nature of the agreement, like anything else, there are mechanisms to handle if there was some sort of a disagreement or something like that.
Okay, and one more, if I might, Mr. Chair. And I don't want to be sort of the negative Nelly of the group, but certainly what happens if all the councils don't agree to this, this agreement? How is it going to be managed with, say, 3 of the 4 or whatever?
3, Mr. Chair. There are a number of options. Number one, we could reallocate the funding appropriately, and or there has been some interest from other municipalities now that they've got wind of this situation, so there may be opportunities to include others.
It's great. I'm glad you have a contingency plan for that. Thank you.
I've always found that if Grimsby and Lincoln can agree on something, then the rest seems to fall into play after that, so. Mayor Easton, you're next.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'm going to need a little bit of guidance on this question. So I'm well aware that we're talking about a joint use agreement specific to emergency preparedness. But I also, and I think we're all pretty clear of the level of training that Grimsby and Lincoln, and I believe West Lincoln receive, and that there's a great deal of equity and strength in that. So that's just a statement, probably based on an impression. So what I want to know is about liability with this. What happens if you're in a situation, and I'm not going to ask the chief, I'm going to ask you, through you, to the CAO so that the chief isn't on the spot. I want to know what happens when you have a situation where you've got certain teams that have very advanced training and other teams that don't. Is there a liability factor, and how is that managed? And I guess, first of all, you better tell me if it's an appropriate question or not, whether it's going to be allowed.
I don't see anybody jumping up and down saying not allowed. I'm curious which department you might think might not be doing training appropriately or not be up to snuff, because I happen to know, for instance, Waynfleet has a very strong program as well for their fire department. They've had some issues over the last number of years, but it's come a long ways as well. But I'll go to the CAO as you recommended.
I don't have, just to be clear, Mr. Chairman, I don't know enough about their system to know at all. I just know that there's been a lot of investments made out here in West Niagara on this whole project, and with Grimsby's training facility, et cetera. I think the standards are pretty high. So I want to be clear about the liability here, that's all.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think the simple answer is there is the potential for liability, but typically those situations are addressed by the site commander when they reach a particular incident or a particular fire, and I think those decisions are made. So there have been some incidents, definitely between some municipalities within our region, just to keep the conversation incredibly general, where some of those comments are made, but they're definitely made at the scene based on response, based on who's there, and based on the particular incident. So I think there's always the risk for certain liabilities, but our fire command are often making those real-time assessments at the scene and assessing what needs to happen at what particular point and the potential risks.
That's great, Mr. Chairman. So the question's asked, I've received an answer, and I think it's an appropriate answer, and I just felt that I wanted to put that to the side. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mayor Easton. Does anybody else have any questions at this point? Seeing none, I have a motion here, moved by Councillor Thompson, seconded by Councillor Bernay, that report FD 18-07 regarding the adoption of a joint emergency management program be received, and that Council enact a bylaw to adopt and implement the Niagara West Emergency Management Program for the town of Lincoln, and that Council enact a bylaw to execute a shared services agreement between the town of Lincoln, the town of Grimsby, the Township of West Lincoln, and the Township of Waynfleet for emergency management services to take effect in 2019, subject to budget approval. Are there any questions to this motion? All those in favor? That's carried. Our next report this evening is the Fire Master Plan Progress Report. Back to you again, Mr. Hudson.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As council may recall, we engaged upon a master plan for the fire department back in 2015. The Fire Master Plan had 28 recommendations, and this is simply a status report. Typically, the Fire Master Plan is a look at a 5 to 10 year window down the road, and depending on the dynamics of what's happening in the community, it could be closer to 5 or closer to 10. I think given the growth in Lincoln, we're probably looking at a shorter term. But in any event, just past the halfway mark as far as the 5-year window goes, we have a number of recommendations already complete, and a number are also underway, to the extent that 22 of the 28 recommendations are expected to be completed at the end of the year, and that would leave 6 outstanding. And the report identifies the particular ones, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Chief Hudson. And by the way, in the one repair that was done to Fire Hall over in Beamsville, thank you for doing that. I was totally happy to see that work underway and it actually being completed. Go ahead, Councillor Ranjima.
Thank you, Chair Foster. My question is regarding item number 4 in the chart, the residential sprinkler bylaw. So we know that sprinklers save lives and they're valuable in rural municipalities, particularly where there's a lot of travel time and response times are a bit of a challenge. So in the meantime, until requirements of the building code are if they're amended to the point where we can enforce the installation of sprinklers in residential developments. Have we looked at incentive programs? Maybe this is through the CAO. Is there something else we can do in the meantime because there's going to continue to be developments that are put in place without these sprinklers between now and that time?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, coming into the tail end of that question, I know it's a conversation Chief Hudson and our director and planning staff have had on a fairly regular basis. I know I've been part of some of those conversations where the chief does definitely try to encourage it. You're right, it's not part of the current building code, and so from an enforcement standpoint, it does become difficult. We continue to have conversations. In terms of incentives, I think when we look at incentives, some of the incentives are more focused on development approvals and the various development aspects, nothing specific as it relates to residential sprinkling. But I know it is a topic. It is one of those things that I think you're going to see us push harder. We definitely start from the place of desiring developments to put it in. We often get pushback. Some do it, and I think as we look at higher density developments, you're going to see a demand, I think, from those buying the product. And as I think sprinkler systems become more affordable and I think the market starts expanding as it relates to that, you're going to see, I think, a general movement towards it, but there's nothing from the perspective of incentivizing it, at least not from a financial standpoint at this particular time that we are doing.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if there is an example of that in any municipalities that have put some sort of an incentive program in place through the development process. I guess we don't know of any right now, but it seems like it might be something to look into.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I do know of one community up near Huntsville that gave a credit towards their fire department component of the development charges, but it was fairly small in terms of a dollar figure, so I don't think it was really that effective. But I can say that every development application we have, every site plan application, every subdivision agreement application that comes across our desk, we always make the comment the recommendation to include sprinklers.
Yeah.
But it's a financial and an educational piece that we haven't been able to get over yet. So,
Yeah, well, that's maybe something we can talk about more at budget time. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mayor Easton, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I must be in a risk mood tonight. I just want to quickly ask the chief if, in regard to anything that's in progress, I mean, I think certainly I don't see any situations where the council has said you must not do, so it's good to know that there's progress being made. So of all these things that are in progress, is the risk level in all of these, what's the status of it? Do you have any concerns at all through you, Mr. Chairman, to the chief?
through you, Mr. Chair, no particular concerns. I think a lot of the ones that are in progress are due to external factors such as timing of buildings, other projects being completed, that kind of thing. But in terms of managing risk, I think we have systems in place that we're able to manage the risk effectively. I don't have any real concerns. I have, put it this way, I'm not up at night worrying about any of the particular concerns, touch wood, that are identified in the report here.
Okay, that's good. So progress is being made. Mr. Chairman, in regard to item 14, through you, I would appreciate it if the chief would give us a little bit more information on that. I really don't remember what this is about, so a little refresh would help.
Through you, Mr. Chair, very briefly, our portable radios that the firefighters carry with them have an orange button on them that they can press if they're in trouble in an emergency situation. And even if they can't speak, at least if they can press the button, a signal goes out over the radio and people know that they're in trouble. And our radios actually are able to tell whose radio it is. And at present time, they can be activated with our local radios, but the St. Catharines Dispatch Center cannot decode these yet. They've been going through a number of radio changes. So at the present time, if one of our firefighters gets into trouble, they can press the button and we can see on the scene. The incident commander can actually see who's in trouble and start emergency procedures at that time. But as a backup, it's always preferable to have another set of ears listening, i.e. The dispatch center, and it's that piece that hasn't been completed yet.
Okay, so I consider that to be a pretty important element, Mr. Chairman, but it looks like it'll be done this year, so fair enough. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chief.
Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the chief. Looking at this report, I'd say congratulations to you and the staff at the fire department for the results that you've got. I mean, if you look at everything that's on here, I think you cover the gamut in staffing, in process, in buildings, in training, in, you name it, you've got it on here. And to have 6 left at the end of the year, my only question is, do we see another plan in 2019 to carry us through the next 4 years?
Through you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned, 2015 was the date of this, so I anticipate around 2020. So we'll give this one 5 years to play out, and about 2020, I would expect it'd be time to refresh this one.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question. Thank you, Paul. You took one away from me. But the one thing I was going to state with that as well, technology, of course, changes dramatically, and one of the things that the guy that sold me my last car mentioned is the fact that safety features and everything else are continuously improving. So I think, and it took you a long time to get the first master plan in place that's there. So I think what Councillor McPherson is saying is really important. I think we owe it to ourselves and the community to make sure that we have plans laid out to really make use of the best technology we possibly can to help in this area. So I have Councillor Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Through you to the chief, just to touch on the sprinkler situation, the in-building sprinkler situation. Has there been any investigation done with regards to insurance cost reductions, either for homeowners or for the municipalities? And if not, is there a possibility of working together with other municipalities to petition or delegate to the insurance company associations to look into promoting this in order to, speed this process along? Because certainly, from a logical standpoint, it seems that you can reduce significant damage costs and life costs by having these in place.
Through you, Mr. Chair, there are a couple of organizations that are spearheading some of the campaigns that you speak of. The Ontario Fire Association of Fire Chiefs is one of them that attempts to disseminate information in this regard. What we're fighting actually in a lot of cases is a strong lobby from the building sector who aren't necessarily as accepting of sprinkler technology as the fire sector. And what we find, quite frankly, there's a lot of misinformation out there about fire sprinklers, and what you see in the movies is not actually how a sprinkler works. And although there are some insurance companies that offer some discounts if you have a fire sprinkler in your home, there are others that don't because they think that what you lose in fire damage you're going to make up in water damage, which I don't know if I buy that, the validity of that argument. But to answer your question, yes, there are a number of organizations that continually fight this fight, and hopefully one day.
Okay, thank you. Also, if I might, I have a couple more quick ones. In and around the radio system, first of all, if I'm not mistaken, St. Catharines is going to P25. We're obviously, I would assume we're not going to. Is that going to cause us problems moving forward with interoperability? And if so, how are we going to manage that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, we are not going down the P25 road for a number of technical and cost reasons and operational difficulties that we foresee with that. I was actually in St. Catharines Communications Center today speaking about this very thing. They will have means by which they can patch the two radio systems together. So if, St. Catharines is our neighbor, if they are on the P25 system and Lincoln is not, they're able to patch the two radio systems together so we can seamlessly talk to each other. As you may recall, in Lincoln, we've invested significant amounts of money into our radio system, and it's a very robust radio system. The town of Grimsby has actually embarked on a very similar approach, and you'll see in the budget coming up that we'll be taking some additional steps to add some redundancies, add some resilience, and add operational efficiencies to both our departments. So we actually have a very, very good and robust system that I would put money on over the P25 system in terms of operations.
So thank you very much for not going down that road. That is just a super costly road that really doesn't have a huge number of benefits attached to it. The last thing is with regards to the emergency buttons. I know that the radios that you guys are utilizing, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, are the Moto Turbos, and they do have the capability of man-down technology, which is used out in the oil fields and whatnot. Is there any thought process in regards to implementing something like that as well as the emergency button system?
I think we have looked at that through you, Mr. Chair. We have looked at that option. I think what we want to do is implement the first phase of this, having the buttons, make sure all the kinks are worked out and it's working properly, and then we can look at that as an additional phase to this. So we do have other things. We have the air packs the firefighters wear actually have a man-down feature as well, so this would be a backup to that.
Thank you very much, Chief. Appreciate all the hard work you're doing on this.
Mr. CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think once a year we hear from the chief as it relates to the master plan progress, as it relates to the annual plan, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't take the chance to acknowledge the dedicated group of individuals we have, both men and women, that make up our fire service. And so I think it's important to highlight that group. They give up their personal time to keep our community safe. Their families give up their loved ones and put their loved ones in the face of sometimes dire situations. So I think it's important to acknowledge them. There's a high level of skill. I think you've seen that by the master plan that the chiefs presented, the updates, and where we are with that. So my sincere thanks to our fire service.
I had a quick question from Councillor Rajima, and then back to you, Mary Easton.
So yes, also thank you very much for all the hard work that you do, and we really appreciate this report. Councillor McPherson was saying earlier on how much he enjoyed this report and all the information that he got from it. So I feel the same way. My question is about Airbnb. We know that generally there's an increased incentive financially in the market for people who are renting out their basement, for example, on a monthly basis to get into the vacation rental business. So I think that over time, if it's not already happening, there's going to be a lot more people getting into vacation rental businesses that weren't in the rental business. So we may see a lot more buildings, you may be aware of this already, that are being rented out on a vacation basis over and above residential rentals. So do we have any plans in place to look at this and monitor this if we possibly can? And also, during our public education program, is this something that we can keep in mind?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's an excellent point, Councillor. It is something fairly new on the horizon, especially for Lincoln, and we haven't really had to address it to an extent yet, but it is on our horizon, on our radar. So we will be looking at some of the extent of what's happening locally, and we're going to try to determine risk and focus our public education, our enforcement strategies based on the risk we see. So it is on our radar.
Yeah, thank you. I guess public education is kind of the only way to really take a stab at it right now, because we're not regulating it, and I don't know if any of us really knows how much is going on within Lincoln as far as vacation rentals.
At this point, if I may add, just it's basically on a complaint basis at this point. There's nothing that we're doing proactively, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is we simply don't know where they are. There's no central registry that we have access to. So, Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mary Easton.
Mr. Chairman, there's a couple of things in the report that I think are quite interesting, and one is under the favorable, which is that there is a decrease in fire department responses, 13% decrease, and then property losses due to fire decrease 51% in 2017 over the previous year. So I don't know whether I want to look at that quite as a favorable. I guess it is financially. It doesn't mean that we're going to train our firefighters any less. And it doesn't really qualify what those fires look like right now with a lot of chemicals that are involved. How do we evaluate the capacity, I guess, of danger that actually represents a fire in 2018 versus a fire in 2000?
Mary Easton, I think you've jumped ahead into the next report.
Oh, I have?
So what we'll do is we'll deal with the motion for this previous report, and then we'll talk about the annual report. By the way, I did it as well. I jumped and gave credit for the door, and it's actually part of the annual report.
My stars. I'm
So
sorry. All
we're
right.
both equally
Thank you.
at fault here.
My
so.
apologies.
So let's deal with this other first. Are there any other final comments on the master plan? I do have a motion moved by Councillor Rajima, seconded by Councillor Thompson, that report FD 1805 regarding progress made with respect to implementing the recommendations of the 2015 Fire Master Plan be received. Any questions to the motion? All those in favor? That is carried. Okay, so Greg will go into your annual report knowing that there's already a question sitting there waiting for you.
Again, I'm pleased to present the annual report. I think I won't belabor it. You know, the facts and figures are there. There are a number of things I'm very pleased about this year, and Mayor Easton has keyed on one of them. Another one really is our decrease in the number of medical assistance calls, and that is working with Niagara EMS. We're able to right-size the number of calls, if I can use that term, to make sure the calls we're responding to, we're being more effective, and the so-called wave-off calls we've really reduced significantly. And the other thing I'd really like to emphasize is our public education program has really skyrocketed last year, had a number of very, very popular and widely accepted events, and we hope to even do better this year. But if I may move right to Mayor Easton's question, I have to say in 2018, and I've been to a number of occupational health and safety seminars and whatnot for firefighters, and the philosophy of the day is any fire we have now is essentially a hazardous materials call. With the materials that are in the typical home, you know, the plastics, the synthetic materials, it's every call is a hazmat call, is what they say. That's why you'll see a number of initiatives relating to firefighter decontamination and some health and safety issues relating to that. But in terms of dollar loss, I don't know that the hazard, the dollar loss, the dollar figure really necessarily relates to what's being burned, other than, you know, it's you have a loss and it's a loss.
Well, that's fine. That's helpful. I mean, I wasn't. I was really more interested in the scenarios that you're having to deal with now, and I think your establishment of the issues with the chemicals is very important. Mr. Chairman, I just want to spend a few minutes going back to 2014, because it seemed that it was in early 2015. It was at the beginning of this council that we had new standards and completely different scenario of expectations. And at that time, I remember feeling that, you know, you don't always want to be making emotional decisions about fire service. You set up that competition from one department to another in terms of who gets what. And what I've noticed, and I think I want to make this point because we're coming to the end of this term now, that the standards at that time, in my mind, were very, very onerous. And the costs seemed to be quite onerous as well, quite overwhelming. Wasn't sure how all of these things were going to work out without a massive commitment from council. And I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is that those standards, which seemed to be so rigid, were taken on by the chief and deputy chief and the captains, and the implementation plans took on a little, I think they took on probably by now a very significant change in approach. It was no longer a matter of here's the standard, you either provide the support for it or you don't. They actually began to look at implementation, I think, more flexibly but more thoroughly. And sometimes they also advised us about risk impact. And I think that the result is, I feel personally that it's easier now to make objective decisions. There's more information available. The work is getting done. Yes, flexibility comes into it, and maybe that is a bit of a problem for the chief and his party from time to time. But overall, I really feel that we are very, very lucky to have the service that we have. We're very lucky to continue to have a volunteer fire service of the caliber that we do. And those are just my observations. I was thinking about this when I first read the report. I feel a lot of unnecessary decisions have been removed from council by the way that the fire service manages their budget and manages their accreditation standards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor Easton. Are there any more comments on the annual report? Councillor Bernay.
Thank you, Chair Foster, through you to the chief. Just wanted to echo my comments as other councillors have. I mean, this is a tremendous story. I mean, when you look at, some of these bullet points on this favorable, on what this, volunteer fire department looks after in terms of the year, in terms of, the assets and the actions and the property saved and the reductions they've had and the commitment that these firefighters have to put out, an average of 112 hours of training in 2017. Like, that's mind-boggling to me. And I just, it's a great news story, but, one can't go past, these 2 bullet points of the unfavorable. And Chief Hudson, through you, Chair Foster, Chief Hudson, you made a comment earlier in your presentation about something that didn't keep you up at night, but I'm sure this bullet point here that speaks in terms of response times and, the continual issue that we talk about every year in terms of fire and firefighting, in terms of our response time, especially in the urban areas. It's got to be concerning when we continue to say that, sufficient numbers of firefighters are not arriving on scene within an acceptable period of time in order to carry out critical rescue and fire suppression tasks safely and effectively. So obviously that's something we need to continue to be cognizant of. So along those lines, I too went too far into this report too early, but one of the things we talked about last year was our inability to get out to where we've got about 1,000 migrant workers. And we got 150 buildings, and quite honestly, we just don't have the resources. Just wondering, through you, Chair Foster, if the chief might be able to comment on any positives that we're being able to get out to those buildings to look at those areas where we have 1,000 migrant workers in our community.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we've actually focused on migrant housing workers a lot more this year. Actually, we started even last year really trying to focus on the higher risk ones. We've been in constant contact with Niagara Regional Health Department, who inspect these every year, and they've been very cooperative in kind of identifying some of the bigger ones or some of the more risk-prone ones. So we're targeting, obviously the riskier ones first. We still have a schedule. We recognize we don't have the resources to hit every migrant housing place every year, so we're doing it on a rotating schedule, again, based on risk. And again, if there's ever a complaint, that trumps everything. If there's a complaint lodged against any of these, then obviously we go right to it. But I'm happy to say that our frequency has increased dramatically over the last year, and I think we're back on track. Our hope is to have a 4 to 5 year cycle where we inspect all of them within that cycle, and we're on track for doing that as we speak. So,
thanks very much, Chief Hudson.
Okay. So, what do you? Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So,
Person.
just this is a very, very good story. There certainly were some learnings for me in here. One of the things that I want to comment on is that it looks like we're successful in our recruiting, and I know that's probably a significant challenge, but if you look at the number of trainees or new firefighters that we're bringing on and spread out nice and evenly across all 4 halls, that is worth, in my mind, worth noting, that you see the retirements and you see that, we're going to have some attrition, but you're bringing on new people. I assume there's a fair number of young people that are involved in there, and good on you and Deputy Fire Chief Blake for staying on top of that. And as we grow as a community, we're going to need to add more, I'm sure, but that was certainly of note. The other compliment I would extend is your visibility to the community and a number of events that you've been at. And I've been I've been at the BIA at the farmer's market, and the trucks are there. You know, and that visibility, I think, is huge for our residents to see you at that long list of activities that you've got in the report. So again, good on you. My learning was, you know, I was under the impression that all calls were a 9-minute call. And when I see the report here and see that there are places in the community that we have, you know, a little bit longer out in the rural area to respond, you know, it makes me feel a little bit better because, you know, I know in a volunteer fire fighting force, it's so difficult to get the firefighters there first, you know. So great report. A suggestion, maybe through you, Mr. Chair, is a dashboard of some kind for this report. Is there something we could put together that would show in a nice dashboard format to put on the website, so that we've got out there some information coming out of this report that, you know, somebody from the community could easily, quickly take a look and say, here's how we're doing. Just a suggestion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think that's a great idea. I think staff should take that away and think about that. There's a number of areas where that type of thing would be good as well. Some of the community services programs, et cetera, as well, might make a lot of sense to do something like that. So,
If I may just chime in on that one, Mr. Chair, that's we're taking a cue from our Public Works colleagues who have developed a similar approach, and we're certainly looking at replicating something very similar, because we understand the importance of getting some of this information out to the community. So, thank you.
I'm going to echo the fact that this is a good news story, and and by the way, when you see me jumping up down saying, great, the doors are finally fixed, you know that things are going well. So I have a motion moved by Councillor Rengima, seconded by Councillor McPherson, that report FD 18-06 regarding the 2017 Fire Department Annual Report be received for information. Are there any questions to the motion? All those in favor? That's carried. And now the last of our all fire department all the time reports this evening. We will ask Chief Hudson concerning the memorandum of understanding concerning Niagara CBRNE incident response team.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very briefly, this is another good news story of cooperation and communities working together. So we have had since 2002 a joint team that would respond to what was formerly known as hazardous materials. They've expanded the scope to include biological, nuclear, and some other things. So basically, this is a refresh of an operational document to allow every municipality in the Niagara region, as well as Niagara Regional Police, Niagara EMS, and Niagara Health System to work collaboratively to manage a CBRNE incident within our borders. So.
Okay, are there any questions? Oh yes, Mary Easton, go ahead.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman, but I get frequent comments from people about this whole issue of managing these hazardous materials, particularly the ones that come through that aren't obvious. People know that there are trucks that are carrying this sort of thing, but also CN carries them as well. Is there a way that we could create a user-friendly communication on this to reassure people that we certainly do have a plan in place and that there are staff trained, and what can we do about this? Because I'd like to see this go way beyond our knowledge of it. I think this is something that is actually on people's minds a lot. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the appropriate person. I don't know who.
Start with the CAO and then we'll go elsewhere.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the chief's probably more able to answer it, but I think the simple answer is yes. I think always reassuring our community that when these particular hazards are traveling through our community and in our community, that there is a level of safety, that there's a level of training, I think is absolutely important. But maybe the chief can highlight some of the works they're already doing and some of the partnerships currently in place, and then absolutely we can supplement those.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely. In fact, one of the duties of the emergency management position that I was speaking of earlier is a public education piece. And I think between the fire chiefs, the communications staff from each municipality and the emergency management staff that we can certainly do a better job in getting the information out to the public in terms of what we do to manage our risks. Because I agree with Mayor Easton. I think there's a lot of things that we do behind the scenes that people don't necessarily know about, and I think it would set their minds at ease if we get some of that information out there. So, point well taken.
That's good. I'll look forward to that, Mr. Chairman. I think this could be really quite a profound message to give to people. I mean, I think everybody knows the fire department does a great job on all things that are related to fires and fire service and education and support. But this is an evolving area that I think could that really brings concern to people. Some of it we don't have control over, so it's even more important for people to know what we can do in response.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Chief Hudson. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rajima and seconded by Councillor McPherson that report FD 18-08 regarding the Memorandum of Understanding in respect to the Niagara CBRNE Incident Response Team be received for information. Are there any questions to the motion? All those in favor? That's carried. Okay, our next report is the year-end treasurer's report. So Ms. Safani and CAO Kirkopoulos, you guys are on the hook here. So Angela, go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. This is just an overarching report to provide to Council a year-end summary of the results of the 2017 year-end. Included in the report are two charts, one presenting the revenues compared to budget, the other presenting the expenses compared to budget, as well as two summaries for year-end results, the reserves schedule providing the year-end final numbers, and the capital projects carry forward, something that's been interested in, Council has been interested in the past. It shows monies that are carried forward, either projects ongoing or monies yet to be used.
Mr. Kirkopoulos.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, just to dovetail and maybe point to chart one, and I think it's important that we pick up on something that KPMG, our auditor, said earlier in the evening. You'll notice on that first chart, which is on page 3 of the report, but page 159 of your package, there's a couple areas I want to bring your attention to. One being our revenues around water and wastewater, and I think you heard our auditors talk about that, and there's a number of reasons for that. We're on a fixed rate. Last year was a very wet year, and so I think we're going to get those fluctuations. I know when I met with our auditors, they brought that particular issue up, asked if I had had any concerns with that particular issue. The other one is our about $100,000 difference around fines, penalties, and interest, and I think that's a bit of a success story, although it doesn't look like that when you look at this particular chart. Staff have done a much better job and have been far more successful in getting people to pay their taxes, which means we're not getting as much interest and as much arrears payment. And so you can see the difference that's highlighted there. And I think lastly, again, piggybacking on these unexpected incidents, whether it be emergencies, whether it be rainfall and so forth. Last year, both from a snow clearing perspective and just an unprecedented level of storm activity where we actually had to do a voluntary evacuation, something we've never done before. There were significant costs to that. Some we were able to recoup. Some we're currently in the process of still working with senior levels of government to recoup. So at the end of the day, you know, there's unexpected costs that we unfortunately found ourselves with in 2017, but I think as council's heard and directed on a number of occasions, we continue to look at efficiencies, we continue to assess and develop financial sustainability policies, our new asset management policy, as well as looking at various thresholds we heard this evening, the ability to look at revenues. So moving forward, we're going to continue as part of this next budget process to look at that contingency planning, albeit very hard when you look at weather-related incidents or snow clearing to make those contingencies, but we're also seeing a little bit of it on the construction side, so I think we're going to take a far more deliberate look as we go through budgets this year and do our best once again to assess for whatever those increases are that we're seeing in the market. So,
Thank you. A question to you, Angela. The government grants, of course, were considerably higher that we received this past year. Two things with that. Could you just briefly remind us of why it was so significantly higher? And then secondly, with that, it's pretty obvious there's a change in government has happened in Ontario, and the continuing discussion is efficiencies. I like that term, but usually what efficiencies mean is looking at programs and cutting back. So are there any concerns from staff that some of these granting programs and stuff like that are of concern?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. The main driver for that grant category is the disaster recovery. That's where that monies would be lumped into. So that ended up being, I believe, $420 some odd $1,000 that we received to mitigate some of our expenses. Looking forward into the balance of 18 and 19, the main drivers that the province is looking at, their funding really isn't going to be impacted. A lot of our funding comes from the federal government at this point, the ones that we have budgeted for. So right now, there is no change. We shouldn't see an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions to Angela on the year-end report? Councillor McPherson.
So to that discussion about conservative investing, is that a budget discussion, or is that a report that comes back with some recommendations on things that we could be doing, or how does that play itself out?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I can definitely start and Angela can add, but one of the things that we received council direction on and we brought forward was a financial sustainability plan, and part of that financial sustainability plan is to look at the various additional policies that we have in place, one being an investment policy, another being long-term borrowing thresholds, and just to share with council where we're at on all of those. And so we are kind of heading into that final stage of that financial sustainability plan, likely want to have something in front of you in the fall. And then the second step with the new term of council would be look at those particular policies that are in place and determine, is there any room, is there any flexibility, and what is council's desire at the end of the day. I think similar to what Scott highlighted earlier, where we're not spending money out of some reserves and they're staying there, maybe looking at a more of a longer term investment that yields a higher return versus where we're going to need monies in those particular reserves and stay I think conservative as we currently are, which I think, as Scott highlighted, isn't any different than you're seeing in a lot of municipalities. But it's having that longer term financial outlook and determining where can you facilitate additional revenues or additional investments. So that will be coming forward.
Thank you.
It's always a tough discussion when you deal with these areas, because you know, this is not our money, this is the municipality's money, and sometimes having a small c conservative approach to it long term isn't a bad thing. You know, we are going to see interest rates go up, so you know, conceivably we might be making a bit more money in the future with some things as well, but this municipality has always been very conservative with it, and I don't know, personally I think it's a good thing. But, you know, Obviously, in the future, other opportunities might be available, so. Mayor Easton.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions of the report. I think it's self-explanatory, but I would, now that we have this report, through you to the CAO, I'm interested to know how the sustainability model that was brought forward, I think maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, how that report and these results will come together for future planning.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think to answer the mayor's question, I mean, this is a year-by-year update that we give you. I think our financial sustainability framework and the model that we're going to put in front of you definitely is more of a longer-term outlook, not necessarily the ebbs and flows that we have on a yearly basis, but rather where do we want to invest, what are the long-term investments, and I think laying out a number of scenarios. What I think Angela and staff are doing right now is looking at what are some of those financial models that we need to look at if we were to invest X, if we were to increase our long-term borrowing thresholds. For example, if we were to come up to that 10% threshold that we've set, what does that look like? Where does that money get invested? And what does that chart sort of look like at the end of the day? So the two definitely are interrelated in terms of some of the day-to-day and more year-by-year things we're seeing. You know, if I think about from a planning perspective, the number of building permits that we're going to issue this coming year, and then the potential fees and the associated taxes that we're going to get in the coming years, you're going to start to see those things increase. And so what level of investment do we need to match, and what level of service do we need to ensure that the community is receiving at the same time with that particular growth? So they all are interrelated. I think when we bring back the next report of the financial sustainability plan, you're going to start seeing some of the modeling we want council direction on, so that if we are going to increase investment, if we're going to increase borrowing, what does that look like, and where is council's comfort level?
That's fine, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to the situation where with the amount of revenue that we have coming in, we're really only going to have this window of opportunity to be receiving that money. A lot of it will come through DC charges, and we need to know that we have a plan in place. I don't think it's a particularly good idea just to say, well, we're not going to invest. We really need to be asking ourselves, what are we going to do with this money? And if anybody asks us what our long-term plan is, what would we say? You know, how much clarity can we bring to the justification for all of that? So I'm really looking forward to the next go around on this one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a motion moved by Councillor McPherson. Oh, and unfortunately, Councillor Rangima isn't here at the moment, so we. Here, she's coming back. So I have a motion moved by Councillor McPherson, seconded by Councillor Rangima, that report TR 18-18 regarding the 2017 year-end Treasurer's Report be received as information. Any questions to the motion? All those in favor? That's carried. I had a bet with the clerk that this next report would generate the most discussion this evening, so we'll just see what happens, okay? It wasn't a very big bet. Ms. Safani, this next report is concerning small-scale agriculture food tax incentives for farmers.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. This report was just brought forward to council as information. It's just, the ministry has introduced in 2018 a new subclass of taxes for value-added farms that have a commercial or industrial component on their farms. So in the region's 2018 policy, this wasn't adopted, but will be looked at in the 2019 policy. So we will be having further discussions as this unfolds. I just wanted to bring it forward to council. As more information is coming forward, you're going to probably hear more and more about this and more interest in this. So I just wanted you to be aware of it. On the flip, what the impact of this is, we don't know yet. MPAC hasn't been around to assess the properties. They say it's going to be foot on property, so they actually have to go through assessment process and look at these properties and then bring it back to us. And then we can have a better, fulsome discussion on what those impacts will be.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bernay, you have the next 25 minutes on the floor, so I can win this bet, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Foster. I don't think I can go till 9 o'clock. Quite honestly, I came here with a number of questions, but, Angela has kind of obviously made a comment that at this point we don't know the impact because, I think, we are a Center for Agricultural Excellence through you, Mr. Chair, and, this is a great report, but, when I read it, I'm trying to comprehend, what is the real impact that this could have on a small farm operation in Lincoln. Angela has said at this point we don't know, it's premature. I do believe it's great that as a council we're getting this information. That's terrific. I appreciate that. But I hear it all the time, and I'm sure Paul, one of Mr. Deanne's struggles in his early times have been, when we talk to businesses in our downtown, we talk to a lot of businesses that really don't understand our incentive programs in the business core in terms of facade improvements and stuff. So I think the communication and how this rolls out. So I mean, that was going to be my question. I think it's kind of a moot point now, but how is this going to roll out? Is it information that comes to the town, to the municipality through MPAC, or will it come through the region? Will this visibility look like? Those were the questions I had, but I think Angela is saying at this point it's premature. We don't know, but I think this is a good report, but it's what we do with this report and how we use it and how we communicate that to the people in this small sector of agri-food that could use this to help their businesses. So thank you. I'm sorry I let you down on the 25 minutes.
That's okay. Go ahead, Angela. You can fill it.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I just want to be clear was this is a tax policy, so if it's adopted, we'll have new tax classes, just like we have residential commercial. We'll be adding new tax classes with, that first 50,000 will be reduced by 75%. If it is adopted. And when I say if it's adopted, it's not necessarily just through, we'll have a voice at the table, but we will be a voice of the other 12 municipalities to have that opinion, and is the region going to adopt it or not adopt it? So that's the other conversation we have to have. And again, one thing I didn't mention was the education. They did adopt this, so they will be granting back or deducting from their revenues that portion.
Okay, Tony? Yep. I have Councillor McPherson, then Mayor Easton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I absolutely took this as a tax savings for existing agricultural operations, potentially. Am I correct in that?
Yes, those properties that have a commercial, industrial or commercial component, as well as farm.
So, in comment more than anything, an incentive is something that we would put in place for a need. We have a need. We're going to put in an incentive in place to drive behavior. And, there certainly are new businesses that are potentially coming to Lincoln that, would maybe look at this as part of the reason to come. But, I just fear the loss of revenue as a result of this, just overriding policy change within our community. So, I am all about economic development, and I'm all about, growing that piece of our community, but I don't like to give money away, and I see a real risk here in our particular community that has a lot of this, potentially.
I have Mayor Easton and then Councillor Thompson.
Mr. Chairman, this is exactly my concern about this, and it is going to be absolutely essential that the Town of Lincoln staff ensure that the mayor and the regional councillor in the next term are absolutely clear about what this impact is going to be. Somehow we're going to have to have scenarios run. We just cannot go into a meeting where a decision will have to be made with a very limited amount of information. And this happens far too much now. It's very, very stressful and it's very difficult. So this is one where we could have a completely opposite and opposing position for the very reason that the councillor has mentioned. So, I mean, if MPAC decides this, Mr. Chairman, through you, what would be the turnaround time on it? And, I mean, typically, the region will go to a meeting of the treasurers and they constitute that as a major consultation. Well, it's not a major consultation. And so I don't know how we're going to get around this in the future, because we have more and more of these situations where there's apparently consultation that's done. You end up at the meeting, you don't have the information that you need, and I think this could be disastrous for us. I don't see any other municipality that has the same situation at all that we have, because even in Niagara-on-the-Lake, they, they put a lot of their farm operations into, the value adds go into industrial. So they may be protected by this one statement on commercial and or industrial. We need a lot more information on this, a lot more interpretation. It's going to have to be real time as well. Thank you.
So, Mr. Deaney and Angela back there, any comments from either one of you on this at this point? I think there's some valid concerns have been brought forward.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Again, to the mayor's points, valid points. When MPAC is not planning on having any numbers probably till 2019 for us, even though this took effect in 2018, because they have to do the investigation. Once we have those numbers, we will be bringing it down to council. Like, we'll be looking at forecasting and seeing what the actual implications would be for Lincoln specifically. To the mayor's point, yes, the regions does sit at the area treasurers meetings, and we do have that discussion. That's, again, why I want to bring it forward to council, so we can have this full conversation now, get the impact of what council wants to see, and then bring that back to the area treasurers and have a vote there.
Well, I mean, I understand that, Mr. Chairman, and I very much appreciate the advance notice, but, if MPAC makes their decision and there isn't very much time between their decision and when it's going to be implemented, that really isn't going to help us very much. So is there a way that we can actually do some of our own modeling on what this might look like?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, we could attempt to do that. I was, again, speaking with MPAC. There's a lot of unknowns at this time. Again, this is only on the smaller properties. Anything over $1 million wouldn't be picked up in this category. But we could look at modeling, looking at farms with those categories and seeing if we can pull out those and see what it looks like at this point. But I think once MPAC actually does the reassessment in 2019, we may see additional properties that we are not capturing right now.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm not looking for, a massive parallel production here, but if there is a way to look at a sample, it would be helpful for us to get our heads around this. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can you take that away as advice or concerns or quasi-direction? Okay. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things in and around this situation that I'm not getting a huge amount of clarity on. Is this going to be in addition to the already reduced agricultural rate on the rest of the property? Is this further reducing the commercial portion? Is that what I'm to understand on this?
Go ahead, Angela.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, so a farm could have potentially 3 different classes or more, I guess. So there's the farm, which is 25% of residential, but the commercial or the industrial, they would be taxed at their regular rate and then reduced 75%. So if they're supposed to pay I think in our example here, it shows the tax rate at 1.7349. That's our current commercial tax rate. 75% of that would be a reduction, so on that tax rate. So whatever the category, so on the commercial and the industrial would be reduced by 75%.
Okay, so if I can continue down the path I'm going to go on, because now that that's completely clear to me, now we have a bigger problem. The issue in and around the fact that we have commercial operations already operating on agricultural properties, not paying commercial taxes for those portions already. Now we're saying we're going to discount that by 75%. This could be rather troubling for the local commercial people that are in commercial zoning straight away doing similar type operations. I mean, this is kind of a recipe for trouble any which way you look at it. And I'm just very concerned about this, certainly. I'm also wondering from a standpoint of implementation, will it happen over in a more cyclical way from a standpoint over 4 years or over 3 years as the assessments change? Will we see that come into play in a bigger way at the end of year 4, or maybe Mrs. Fanny can answer that one for me.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. How I'm seeing it, again, back to MPAC's comments, was foot on property. So when they do the reassessment in 2019, hopefully they get us that information for that year. Otherwise, we may be pushing this back even another year. But I think then it would be cyclical. As properties change, we'd pick them up just like as we do now. If the property changes, we would see that change. The other concern, again, with this is as they go on to properties, they may see commercial activity that was never captured, I believe is what you were alluding to. So that can happen going forward as well, which could open cause another can of worms.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just clarification on Councillor Thompson's question there. As I understand the issue, Councillor Thompson, it's that we have current taxing of a operation that's just agriculture. They're not getting the commercial piece. So in that case, are you suggesting that they would come forward with their commercial piece and ask for this discount? Is that what you're thinking? Because today they're getting away without the commercial taxing. That's your issue.
Right.
Right. And now that this comes into effect, they'll say, hey, I've got a commercial piece here now. I need to get it properly zoned, and now I qualify for the 75% discount. Interesting.
Now you still got 15 minutes, so. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Perhaps the CAO has some insight, because he's always got some insight on things. In and around mine and Councillor McPherson's dilemma, so to speak.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if I've got any insight. I do think we need a little bit more information, and we need to be clear on what actually this incentive entails, because it's about improvements to existing farming operations. So it's not about an existing farming operation just coming forward and seeking that rebate. It's actually about making improvements, so trying to incentivize a farmer who currently is operating a potential farm to move forward and actually look at a value add piece. So if I think about wineries, if I think about other things, the other difference is that you're talking about a threshold of $1 million. And so when you look at, I think, size, scope, and what $1 million buys you in today's day and age, I don't think it's as big a concern as we may. And and again, I'm cautious in saying that without a little bit more information. So I do want us to go back collectively. I want us to look at it. And I think if and when we receive more information from MPAC, more of a when, we'll be in front of council again. But I think the way I read it, this is about trying to promote that value-added piece coming. It's about an improvement to existing farm property, not just the farm property that currently has it in place.
So, and I appreciate exactly what you're saying, and that's how I read it exactly. Our challenge is going to be the folks that are all of a sudden, as Councillor McPherson alluded to, improving their commercial operation that they've never actually declared they had. Yes, I know it's $1 million threshold. Maybe we can find out a little bit more from MPAC in regards to how they would deal with commercial operations that are actually existing but not on record. Sure. In and around that. That would be helpful to me.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think on that particular point, I mean, I can tell you, MPAC, if they conduct an investigation, always gets their proverbial pound of flesh. I'm less concerned about that. Angela continues to remind me about the vigilance in which MPAC does these sorts of assessments. So if there is a property, I think looking at the scenario that you've described that falls into that particular case, MPAC, albeit may take some time to do their investigation, they will do their investigation and determine if it was in operation and when it was in an operation until, and if there are some discounts to be applied, they would be applied subject to going back and looking at what we're owed anyways.
Okay, just a quick comment. One of the earliest points made in the discussion was incentive programs and what we have available and whether or not people are aware of them. And I know, Councillor McPherson, you're on the BIA, and I know things have been promoted very highly through the BIA organization, but I think things like the community improvement programs that we do have in place and a variety of other incentives, I think they have to be reinforced with businesses to let them know really what's going on. I think the early comment was bang on that sometimes the businesses really don't understand what's available to them, and in fact, we do have a really nice suite of tools within these incentive programs, many of which we have never used, but potentially could. So anyway, that's the challenge to you, Mr. Deaney, is to make sure that people know and understand where they can lean on us for some help to actually do the improvements that it is that we really want. Yes, Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This also may actually allow us to incentivize different things in the agricultural sector than what we were maybe previously entertaining in a CIP type situation, because this is already going to incentivize them in a different way, so we may be able to, anyway, just a thought process.
So more to come. I have a motion moved by Councillor Renchima, seconded by Councillor McPherson, that report TR 18-19 regarding small-scale agri-food tax incentives for farmers be received as information. Are there any questions to the motion? All those in favor? That is carried. I lost. The next report is concerning the Joint Niagara Compliance Audit Committee and updated terms of reference on page 167. Where are we here? I forget who did that report. Courtney. So, Courtney, would you like to give us a quick explanation of this report? Please come forward. We're going to put you on the spot.
All right, I'm just gonna fly off the seam of my pants here, but So basically the report is looking at the different ventures that we're looking. So the 12 municipalities in the Niagara region have basically come to the conclusion that a really good cost-effective way to kind of go about the Compliance Audit Committee, which is regulated in the Municipal Elections Act of 1996. So one of the provisions is that we have to have a Compliance Audit Committee established by October. And we've decided as a Niagara region that it would be a bit more effective and a bit more easy to manage if we all joined in together in terms of saving costs for the membership to the Compliance Audit Committee, the review and selection process, as well as housing the committee. So the committee is established of approximately 7 members, and they serve as long as the sitting council members serve for that term. And they are responsible for reviewing any type of negligence or contraventions related to the act that any candidate might be subject to, as well as any third-party advertiser would as well. So those might consist of candidates running in the election. It might consist of those that are doing advertising on behalf of candidates, either opposing or speaking in favor for them. And they are under review if there is a complaint to the clerk by an elector in the municipality. And they are subject to the review, and they are basically left in front of the board of these 7 committee members, which are sitting accountants, lawyers, they could be past town clerks, it could be legislative coordinators, anyone that's really involved in the auditing process, and they are subject to review to that board. And they are ultimately deciding whether or not you should proceed with a legal process if they are found guilty of a contravention. So what the report is being brought forward to is basically they are being brought forward to all 12 local municipalities in the Niagara region, as well as the Niagara region itself. And we are just basically moving forward with the process. The nomination should be beginning soon. And overall, it's just a very good cost-effective measure to join together, and it's a good way of kind of establishing the cooperation across the Niagara region and the different lower-tier municipalities that have kind of gotten together to really bring this forward. So a lot of work's been brought into it, and a lot of good research from other municipalities in the province, and I think that this would be a really good thing to consider, especially that we're always ensuring that the elections are transparent and a very well thought out process. So I think that this would be a very good thing to consider for you all on council. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions anybody would like to bring up? Councillor Bernay.
No question, just a comment. I mean, somebody that was coming up here to fly in the seat of your pants, that was amazing. I take back all those things I said. You sent me back out in the street to get more signatures. Disqualified my 25 minutes. No, just very articulated very well.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Mary Easton.
I do have a question about bias. And it's another one of the orders of my business for the week. I want to make absolutely certain that if there are questions being asked in municipalities, that that the process is objective. So I don't think that I yet entirely understand what would happen if there was a serious complaint against someone in Lincoln, one of the candidates in Lincoln. Where does that, just go through the scenario of how that gets heard and what happens?
Absolutely. Through you, Mr. Chair. So what would begin with is if an elector had a complaint, let's say it was regarding a candidate, and they didn't file their financial papers properly. So let's say that the amount was $400,000, or it's not $400 over the amount that they sent in. And the financial statements would then be reviewed by the committee based on the complaint through the clerk. So the clerk would actually receive the complaint. So the elector would file that with the clerk would bring it forward to the committee. Now this is kind of where the training in terms of the committee is shared with all the lower tier municipalities. And then once a lower tier municipality receives a complaint, it then becomes the responsibility of the clerk to take on with the complaint on that basis. They would review the complaint in a board setting, and the clerk would actually would clerk that committee specifically on the meeting night, and they would come to an agreement of whether or not there should be legal proceedings regarding this. This could be in terms of financial statements. It could be an unethical type of behavior. It could be several different things. It could be something following the election, and it might have been something that's discovered later on. Again, the committee sits as long as the council sits as well, so they kind of move along together. So let's say that down the road they were to come across a contravention, someone could still bring it forward. All the documents are public after the election. The financial statements are public as well, so that can be reviewed at any time. So then on that basis right there, then the municipality takes on the cost of the complaint. Now, what would happen if let's say the person under review, the candidate, was not found guilty of the contravention and that it was a misinterpretation or perhaps an elector trying to make a stink about something where there is nothing, then they would take on the cost of the Compliance Audit Committee. So ultimately, it's a shared joint responsibility, but if something were to occur in a specific lower tier municipality, then it would be brought on by that lower tier municipality.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, through you, when you say it would be brought on by the lower tier municipality, I noticed that there's some, on page 2 at the top, they're talking about a delegation of authority. Does that mean that the clerk, it says the clerk of the committee, but you're talking about the clerk of the central committee, is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So basically, the clerks, whoever takes on that application through the elector, so let's say the town of Lincoln receives a complaint, then Julie would then take on the complaint and she would sit with the committee and she would be the clerk of that committee. So she receives the delegated authority to be able to carry out that committee within the lower tier municipality.
Okay, great. And so the rest of the people at the committee then are objective others who have been chosen from a wide variety of people with different backgrounds. Okay, that's great. So what if somebody engages in some kind of unethical chicanery throughout the election? Or maybe there's just an issue in terms of something as basic as signage and they're not cooperative, or any number of things. Are those things, can those things be heard? Is that a subject matter for this committee?
Through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely. And that's why in many ways, I guess, you could have a contravention in terms of unethical behavior. It could be financial, and sometimes it's the gray area and reading between the lines. And that's really what that Compliance Audit Committee is there for, is to be able to determine, did they really break the act? Did they come into contravention? Was there something unethical there? Is there substance to be able to create a case for legal proceedings? So that's really their job, is to determine that fine line in that gray area where we actually need to be able to move forward with something or put an end to it, and that it would actually do harm to go forward, and that there actually would not be any substance to it. So that's really their role in it, and like you said, all citizen-based.
Okay, I have a specific question. What happens if at the end of the nomination process, the clerk has to go through and check to make sure that everyone who's registered is a valid candidate, and that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So what if it's determined that a candidate has not met all of the tests? What happens then? Do any of those situations have to go to this committee, or are they just dealt with through the delegated authority of the local clerk?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is quite separate from the Compliance Audit Committee. So Julie will be certifying the nominations next week. So that'll be coming Monday on July 30th. So once she certifies those candidates based on the signatures, the endorsement, the registrations, all the qualifications in terms of running for council, she will decide whether they are certified or they're not certified and they're declined. So at that point, the clerk's discretion is final. So that has nothing to do with the Compliance Audit Committee.
Okay, but once that's done, the Compliance Audit Committee and all of its jurisdictions kicks into play.
It's very separate. So anything really in terms of filing for nominations and everything is dealt through the clerk's department. Picture that the Compliance Audit Committee is almost like a next layer, that if something were to go wrong after the certification process. Anything prior to that, no one is certified. So everything is a nomination. You're a nominated candidate versus being certified. So then they would actually be reviewed after if there was something to go into contravention with, but the clerk's discretion is final in terms of certification.
Okay, this sentence, it is more common now for council to delegate the appointment, through you, Mr. Chairman, to delegate the appointment authority to the clerk of the committee in order to remove any perception of bias. Do we have to do anything about that here, or is that done at that committee?
We're going to go to Julie with this.
Okay, at the compliance committee. Thank you.
So what's been best practice is that municipalities have been delegating the authority to the clerk to remove any kind of bias or interference with council. The Compliance Audit Committee operates as a neutral party, and it has no interference with council whatsoever. And that is why council is taken out of that equation.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to ask in around malicious complaints and whatnot being taken to this committee, and my perception is there's a possibility, just based on some of the shenanigans that have gone on at the region over the last term, this could be like an ongoing kind of a perpetual thing where people continue to make malicious complaints and really cost the lower tier municipalities a lot of money. And is there any framework in place that would allow for cost recovery, excuse me, from those complainants if they're found to be malicious?
So as Courtney stated earlier, very eloquently, I might add, those complaints are vetted through the committee. So any application gets vetted through the committee. They have a look at that criteria and what it actually has to meet in order to go forward. And as Courtney pointed out earlier, if it is found that the person is not in contravention of any kind of issue, then the applicant has to pay those fees. It's not on the municipality itself.
Okay.
But if it is in contravention, then we move forward.
Sorry, I didn't know who they was, so, okay, no, that's clear. Okay, perfect, thank you.
Okay. Very good discussion. Thank you very much. I have a motion hidden here, moved by Councillor Bernay and seconded by Councillor Thompson, that the Town of Lincoln continue with its participation in the Joint Niagara Compliance Audit Committee, and that the updated terms of reference attached as Appendix A be approved, and that authority be delegated to the clerk to make any legislative or administrative changes to the terms of reference. Okay, we'll come back to that. And that authority be delegated to the clerk to appoint members to the Compliance Audit Committee. Julie, can you just explain what that second item within this motion actually means and what it really is giving you power-wise with that?
Do you mean number 2, that the authority be delegated
Yes.
to the clerk to make any legislative or administrative changes?
Correct.
So as a joint municipality that is sitting on the Compliance Audit Committee, any kind of new legislation that gets put in place, we have to adopt and put into the terms of reference. We don't really have a choice about that. That is something that needs to be adopted, and that's why that's delegated to the clerk to do so.
Okay, thank you. I didn't really take that from that, so mandated legislative or administrative changes is really what you're saying? Okay. Are there any other questions to the motion? All those in favor? That is carried. And our last written report this evening is concerning Main Street Revitalization Initiative Funding Agreement. And Mr. Deanne.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Through you to the committee. So this report deals with the Main Street Revitalization Initiative that was announced by the province in January 2018, with additional funding information coming out in March 2018. So these funds are through the revitalization program, and the Town of Lincoln has been awarded $58,688.78 to be used for a number of initiatives, as you can see in the report, in terms of our existing CIP programs or some additional municipal infrastructure investment programs. So these funds, we have identified these these funds are being used for our existing CIP programs through additional communication to our businesses, our 3 identified CIP programs for some building facade improvements and grant programs as well. It should be noted as well that because we are depositing these funds into our CIP program, it does not preclude us from identifying some municipal infrastructure programs down the road, so that could also be used for that. For example, signage and wayfinding is what I was thinking about.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions to Mr. Deaney? Oh, everybody. Okay, let's start with Mr. McPherson and then Councillor Rajima.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is good news. You know, I think from a where does it go standpoint, you know, I'd certainly have a preference to make a splash or make an impact rather than it going kind of in the bank. You know, I'd really, and also that we need to spread it. You know, we need to have a Vineland, Beamsville, I don't know if it's equity thing or whatever, but I'd much rather see us invest in something and then say, this is as a result of the monies we got through this grant, as opposed to just throwing it into the CIP and it kind of getting blended, you know, for the next couple of years and getting lost. So just from a disagreement, my personal preference is let's do something. Let's make an impact with it, and let's spend it appropriately across town. But we can point a finger to this was done as a result of a grant that we received. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Paul. Councillor Rajima.
Thank you, Chair Foster. So I was reading through the criteria on, so on page 184 of the agenda, it says under eligible costs, an existing community improvement plan or other municipal land use planning policy that will support the success of small businesses in Main Street areas. So we recently had our, the Vision for Ontario Street come before us recently. So I guess, similar to what Councillor McPherson was saying, it would be nice to, first of all, is that considered a land use planning policy? Is that what we're going to be, is that what it's going to end up being, a land use planning policy? So will it meet the criteria in that regard? So in either case, whether it goes into the community improvement plan or it's used, in either case, I think it would be good to pick something out of that Ontario Street visioning process to apply this to and really make a splash.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Through to the committee member. I mean, yes, definitely. The funds could be used for some beautification or physical infrastructure improvements along Ontario Street. The one caveat to the funding is it does need to be spent by March of 2020. So not saying that the project would be pushed out that far, but it is something that we could definitely look at. I should have mentioned at the start that, I mean, part of the funding agreement is to receive the funds and put it into an account. Because we do have the existing CIP account and program, it does make more sense to deposit in that account. But as I had previously said, we can identify projects from both eligibility lists, so we can definitely use it for an infrastructure program if need be.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the idea, we through this report, we're agreeing to deposit it into the CIP general fund, and then maybe at budget time we would talk a little more specifics about where we might want to apply it. Through you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. So we can definitely, in conversation with my colleagues, both in the Planning and Public Works Department, we can come back with a little bit more of a fulsome report on where we'd like to use these funds for, and then that way we can inform Council.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Thompson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I would like to also request that it be spread evenly across the municipality.
Any other comments? You know, as a Ward 1 councillor currently, I completely disagree. Everything should be in Beamsville, but with the new hat that I want to wear, you're absolutely right. I follow you along, Councillor Thompson. So So, yeah. I have a motion moved by Councillor Thompson and second by Councillor Bernay that report AD 18-10 regarding Ontario's Main Street Revitalization Initiative be received, and that the municipal funding agreement between the AMO, Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and the Corporation of the Town of Lincoln regarding Ontario's Main Street Revitalization Initiative be executed by the Mayor and Clerk. And that the Mayor and Clerk be authorized to execute any and all ancillary documents between the Association of Municipalities, AMO, and the Corporation of the Town of Lincoln deemed necessary for the town to receive funding under Ontario's Main Street Revitalization Initiative, and that the funds received be deposited in the town's Community Improvement Plan Fund for use within the approved funding programs of the town's community improvement plans for Vineland, Beamsville, and the Ontario commercial area. Are there any questions to this motion? All those in favor? That's carried. So just as a commentary, all the motions from this evening's meeting will be presented to Council for final approval this Wednesday evening, July 25th. A little bit sooner than we normally do, but I believe that's our last council meeting for a while, so we will get those forward for that. Are there any councillor inquiries? Any notice of motion? Any announcements? Seeing none, I declare this meeting adjourned.